Nope.
Yes.
All right. Looks like we're live. So, hi, everybody. Welcome to AAPI Book Month panel. Ours is Fantasy Stories. I'm SJ Jones. I go by JJ. I'm the author of Winter Song and Shadow Song, and these are all my lovely panelists. We have Julie Abe, Nafiza Azad, Lori Lee, and Shveta Thakrar. So, everyone say hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
So I just want to start off with introductions. Let's just go alphabetically. That makes it easy for me by last name. So let's start with Julie. Please introduce yourself, your books, what they're, and a sort of a brief description of what they're about.
Okay. So my name is Julie Abbott. I'm the author of Eva Evergreen, Semi-Magical Witch. Cover. It's coming out this August from Little Brown Young Readers. And it's a story of a girl, Eva. She's a 12-year-old girl with just a pinch of magic. And she's trying to pass her witch's test or she'll lose her magic powers forever. And it's a story that's maybe good for people who like Kiki's Delivery Service or Arosha. And my favorite part of the cover is Ember, her flame fox, which is he's supposed to be a fox with fire, but like Eva is a witch without much power, so he's a fox without much flame.
Oh.
So.
All right, thank you. So then, Nafisa, let's talk about what your books are.
My name is Nafiza Azad, and I wrote The Candle and the Flame.
And my favorite part right now.
Oh, we got an echo, I think, in here.
That's weird. Okay, how about now?
Now, okay, it's good. Sorry.
Okay, good.
Start again, please.
Okay, yeah. So I couldn't find the finished copy. So this is the Arc of the Candle and the Flame, which came out last year, and which is about Fatima Ghazala, who lives in the city of Noor, and there's a lot of things. The book is out, so if you're curious, you can read it. My next book is coming out next year, hopefully sometime in the summer. It's called The Wild Ones, a broken anthem for a girl nation, and it is about a group of girls who go around the world saving other girls. And right now, that's all I'm going to say. Yeah, nice. I'm happy to be here.
Great. Okay, Lori, it's your turn.
I'm Lori. I'm the author of the upcoming Forest of Souls, which is a YA fantasy about this girl named Saoirse, who is a spy in training, and she discovers she has the rare ability to shepherd souls, and that causes her to be given this responsibility to control an ancient forest possessed by vengeful spirits that are slowly devouring the kingdoms. And it's about loyalty and friendship between girls and finding your place in the world.
All right, thank you. And Shweta?
Hi. So this is my forthcoming book, also out in August, like Julie's, called Star Daughter. And if you can see, she still has silver hair because she is actually half a star, half human. Sorry, it's kind of hard to do. And when she accidentally, as she nears 17, her buried star heritage starts to come out, and she accidentally burns her dad. And in order to save his life, she has to go find her star mom in the heavenly realm and win a celestial competition to obtain a drop of healing star's blood.
All right. Okay. Thank you guys all so much for introducing yourselves. So this panel is really about drawing on traditions and cultures other than sort of your traditional Western high fantasy. There are a lot of Western high fantasy books out there for every possible category, from young children's to adult. So I want to, if you guys are comfortable sharing, I want to talk a little bit about our own backgrounds, whether or not they've introduced or that they've influenced our book, whether or not we draw from them. And so if you are comfortable sharing, why don't we talk about what places our stories come from and the ideas come from. So this time I'm just going to pick people at random. So Lori, you have the hot spot.
It took a really long time for me to give myself permission to draw from my own culture. I think it was just because I didn't think that was anything that people wanted to read. It was, I mean, I grew up reading that typical Western fantasy, and I thought that was the end all be all of fantasy. I thought that if I want to write fantasy, that's what I have to write. So it took a really long time for me to realize it's not true, and I can actually draw from my own culture, and that was a recent thing for me, like just within the last several years, I would say. Because my very first series came out in 2014, and while the protagonist, I coded her to be Asian. It was a fantasy world. I never explicitly said it, and at that time I still hadn't yet given myself permission to like really go into my own influence. So then with Forest of Souls, which comes out June 23rd, I realized I didn't say that when I introduced myself. June 23rd. So with Forest of Souls, the magical system specifically in the book is influenced by monk shamanism. It's definitely not a one-to-one thing, but it was inspired by it. In monk shamanism, there's, you know, the belief that everything that happens is sort of, it's tied to like the spirits. If something bad happens, you know, maybe you've got a negative spirit or a bad spirit around you, or if you get sick, something's wrong with your spirit. So that kind of idea, and also the idea that when shamans go into the spirit realm, they can often call on animal familiars to help them in the spirit realm. So in that way, the magical system in Forest of Souls, the shamans there, which are not like monk shamans, by the way, but I call them shamans because of the inspiration. The shamans, they cannot use magic without a bond with an animal familiar. So that's where that came from. And then there are little bits of sprinkling of Hmong words in the book, little sprinklings of like my culture and stuff. It's not what I would call strictly Asian fantasy. Like, my purpose with Forest of Souls was to sort of wed the medieval fantasy tropes that I really loved growing up and some of my own cultural influences. And the purpose for that was because I felt like that represented me more than one that was strictly just Hmong or one that was strictly just Western fantasy. It's the kind of book that I would have really loved to read when I was little, because I never, like, I think all of us have this experience where we never saw ourselves reflected in these stories, and I never saw my place within Western fantasy stories, even though I grew up in America. So Force of Souls is sort of me giving myself and giving diaspora teens that place in fantasy.
All right. Well, thank you for telling us. Nafiza, let's talk about you, ma'am. How's
So in The Candle and the Flame, I've been searching, like Laurie, I have been searching for a character that in the literature who reflected me and my conversations with my sisters and my cousins, and I never actually found any, so I figured I might as well write one. So the candle and the flame is very vibrantly reflective of the spaces in which I grew up, the colors, the smells, the foods. Everything is a reflection of my experiences as I was growing up. The multiculturality. I grew up in Lautoka, Fiji, so it's a very multicultural city, and I wanted that to be reflected in the book. And in the Wild Ones, my ancestors moved from India to Fiji, and then we moved from Fiji to Canada. So there's always been this search for identity, and I'm sure most of us will recognize this when I say that we tend to live in liminal spaces where we're never quite sure of, as immigrants, we're never quite sure of where we fit in, and we tend to create spaces for ourselves. So with the Wild Ones, the girls are always traveling from one city to another, and while they pretend that they're fine with not having a concrete place to call home, in actuality, they're all searching for a place to put down roots. So all of these things, the search for identity, navigating your own cultures, because I feel like as immigrants and as second generation immigrants, we tend to create a culture that is completely ours, which has shades of our cultures of origin and the shades of the cultures we live in, but we've somehow shaped it into something that belongs to uniquely to us. So all of these things inform both of my novels so far. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Shweta, why don't we talk about you?
Sure. I agree with everything that's been said so far, and I want to add that I know this is a common experience for a lot of us who come from brown and Black backgrounds, that not only did we not see ourselves, but some of us thought that the only way to get along in the world was to hate ourselves and wish we were white. I certainly did that. And especially because I lived in between 8th grade through the end of my university years, my family, while I was in university, was still there. And I lived in a small town in the Midwest, and that was not a friendly place to us in any way. And, I did for a long time. I wished I were white, and I thought I was ugly and stupid because that's what those kids told me, and there was no one to say otherwise. And so even though I had grown up with these amazing stories from my Hindu heritage, we have these great epics like the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, all of these amazing stories and these amazing figures like Nags that are snake people, and Garuds that are eagle people, and so on. I sort of compartmentalized them, like shoved them over there, and didn't even realize until I was in my mid-20s, and it suddenly struck me, hey, why aren't there books like that available for us? Like, why don't we get to be having magical adventures too? And not just in the white people tradition. Like, why don't we get to use our own cool stuff? And so then I decided, that I was going to take writing seriously, because I'd written on and off my whole life. And when I did, I was going to write brown people. And so many people told me, you're not going to get anywhere with this. Don't even, just self-publish, because no one's ever going to buy this. No one's ever going to want to read it. And I'm just I'm just glad that instead of getting hurt, I just got mad, and I mentally would flip those people off and think, I'll show you. And then, and with time, luckily enough of us stood up and said, we deserve to be seen and represented too. So now we get all these amazing books, and that makes me so happy. And so to bring it into Star Daughter, I actually got inspired by, I say it's a cross between Neil Gaiman's and Charles Vess's Stardust, which I adored, and Tanuja Desai-Hidier's Born Confused, which is a contemporary novel about being a South Asian kid, but it was the first YA novel like that in the North American market. And so I just, I decided to go all out and just put in so many things that I just love about Hindu stories, but also, like I used the heavenly realm of Swarglok and the nakshatras, the constellations, and their apsaras that are celestial dancers, and their nags. But I also wanted to, like Nafiza was saying, I also wanted to make it my own thing. So Sheetal is still very much American. Like the whole book has a very American sensibility, and I would never try to pretend otherwise. I mean, I couldn't write anything that wasn't that way, because I was born and raised here, right? So that's going to come through. But I feel like that's also one way for all of us to be seen, because we are writing the stories that we should have had. So,
all right, thank you. And Julie.
All right. So for me, for cultural influence for Eva Evergreen, I'm Japanese American. I was actually born in Japan, but I grew up mostly in the U.S. That definitely has influenced a lot of what is in the story. Everything from, of course, like the food, to sort of cultural references, or even the way the houses are shaped. And for me, it's like Lori, I know I'm writing about the world I know now. I'm not writing about the world that's super traditional or super what everyone thinks of when they think of Japan, maybe when they think of like geishas or something like that. Like that's not the world I know. I know the world of my grandparents' house and the wood house, the straw floor, or things like that. Although I have actually already gotten feedback from an early reader saying like, oh, this isn't Japanese enough, which for me is kind of interesting. Interesting feedback. as a person of color, as for someone who was born there and has lived there, actually lived in Japan. But I think for me, it's finding a place where it's a story that represents me personally, the American, maybe, yeah, the American influence and also the Japanese influence, and finding a mix between the two where it is the world I know, the world I love, and the world I want to represent. So it is a fine line behind giving what people expect and also what you yourself feel. But I think this story represents the world, the modern Japan that I know, and not necessarily the traditional Japan that people may expect. So people will say like, "Oh, well, there's bread. There's not like rice." And I'm like, "Yeah, but just so you know, there's there's bakeries in Japan too. Like people eat bread nowadays." So it's just an interesting mix of cultural influences between what people expect and what I know personally.
Yeah, I actually have a question sort of related to this a little bit later, but I guess I'll talk about myself a little bit. I'm S.J. Jones. My first two books were not Asian inspired when it comes to their fantasy elements. They were actually set in late 18th century Germany. Well, what will be Germany? It wasn't called Germany then, but and one of the first questions I got asked actually at one of my launch parties was, why didn't you write about your own background? And part of that, I won't lie, that a little part of me was kind of resentful that question was asked of me. Like, well, why do you feel like you owe it to your own people to write about yourself? And I was like, I wanted to write about what I loved, and what I loved is classical music. Like specifically, the book I tried to write before Winter Song was a retelling of Mozart's The Magic Flute, and it was terrible. Because I realized that I really just kind of wanted to stage a production of The Magic Flute and not like write a retelling of it. But I took what I loved about it, which was the music, and specifically the music, kind of the late classical, early romantic time period, and then write a story about that. It was also heavily influenced by, obviously, the movie Labyrinth, because there's a Goblin King in there and all the sort of Western sort of fae and fantasy creatures. And I didn't really think about my own background. My mother is Korean, born, raised Korea, immigrated to the United States, and my dad is white. So I didn't think about it in particularly that way. I always intended to write an Asian fantasy at some point, but I didn't want to feel like I had to, that I was like, I don't know, like I was somehow letting my people down, quote unquote. And so, the series that I'm working on now, it's called The Guardians of Dawn. The first book should be out next summer. I deliberately was like, well, I want to write a high fantasy world based on East Asian culture. Not specifically Korean. It's a secondary fantasy world, so it's not going to be like Laurie and like Julie. It's not necessarily like a 1-to-1 sort of a thing. So that took a lot of time for me to even give myself permission to do this. I think a lot of us struggle with that kind of like, am I allowed to? Is some of this kind of sacred that I'm not allowed to really play with or touch or all that sort of stuff? So that's kind of leads into my second question, which sort of ties into what Julie had said about not being Japanese enough, which is, kind of a ridiculous notion. But I do kind of want to throw it back to you guys about whether or not you felt pressure to do justice to your backgrounds, to where you come from, and how you dealt with that pressure necessarily. So we can start with Julie again, since that was her experience sort of led us here.
It's a quite a path, right? So for me, it's definitely when I was starting to write Eva, it was just really my world, my thoughts, and I wasn't agented at the time. Like I didn't have my editor, so I was really just writing for myself and writing for the 8-year-old, 10-year-old me that would want to read this, that wanted to have a girl with dark hair and tan skin on the cover and be like, hey, that actually looks like me. So that was originally who I wrote it for. But after, like the arc, or when I got that feedback, I was in the middle of writing book 2, which is it's continuation of the story. And so there I was like, oh my gosh, like, am I doing this right? Like, do I need to make it more Japanesey? Like, what do I do? So, but for me, I thought like, this is the world that I created for readers like me, not for those critics that might think otherwise. And so I'm trying to, like, it's still a constant, I think, struggle where you have that voice in your head saying like, oh, it's not Japanese enough. It's not culturally acceptable to have to have bread instead of rice because it's not traditional enough. But I do my best to just put that aside, leave that there, and then focus on the story I love. It's hard, but I think it's something that I'm trying to do every day as I write.
Yeah, the kind of question is who the audience is, right? And who is the person that's saying it's not X enough? You know, what influences that? You know, like those sorts of voices that we navigate, whether it is from our own relatives or family members or from the outside, you know. So, Nafiza, do you want to talk about that experience?
Sorry, what was the question?
Oh no, this is me just trying to stitch some interstitial commentary in there. But really, the question is, how do we navigate the permission that we allow ourselves to play with our own cultures in our own work?
For me, there have been so few books where the Muslim protagonists are not that are not issue books where the Muslim female character needs to be saved or the male character is somehow a terrorist. So for me, when I was writing The Candle and the Flame, there was one thing I was sure of, and that was I'm not writing it for the Western gaze. So, which is strange because the book is published in English, but I did make as much use of languages that are more prominent in the world that I come from. And as for pressure, I don't think I felt any because I'm the kind of person who will do whatever I want, no matter what other people think, writing wise. So I've never felt that kind of pressure. But at the same time, there are such few books where the Muslim girls are given permission to just be themselves without having to have a moral objective or to prove something. So I wanted to write someone who was having adventures, who was allowed to be as human, if that's the right word, as any other protagonist in any other fantasy novel. She was not representing any culture per se or any religion. She was just who she was, and she was going to have fun while being who she was. And while her life is not necessarily a very smooth or pleasant in some instances, she still had that the fire inside of her to just be what other kids, took for granted, being a kid, which is really difficult because I now know what you're saying, that you feel the pressure to make your character be something more instead of just being a protagonist or having fun. And yeah, mostly I just wrote it because I wanted to tell the story, and I'm glad that it meant something to people and they got more out of it than I intended, which is a good thing always.
All right, Shveta.
Well, JJ, you had mentioned thinking about, are there things that we have to hold sacred? And that's definitely something that I've struggled with, because since we're kind of all the pioneers of doing this in a lot of ways, there is a lot of pressure on us, I think, to not play with stuff. And also, I'm sure this has probably happened to all of you, that you get reviews that are like, well, this didn't teach me enough about whatever culture. And it's like, but this is a novel, not a textbook. And I did change things, so please don't treat it like a textbook. Like we get these expectations that a white author probably wouldn't get. And that's, and that's hard. And also when you're playing with something like, in this case, like Hindu mythology, there are going to be people who feel angry about it, even though, in my opinion, it's writing loving fan fiction, if you will. Like you're continuing the conversation in the modern time that you live in. But there will be people who are upset about that, or who, and I'm waiting to see, sorry, my earbud fell out. I'm waiting to see when the second book that I'm working on right now, once that gets announced, I do that more. Actually, I delve a little bit more into mythology, and I'm wondering how people are going to feel about that. But I still consider it loving fan fiction. So so what right do we have? I think whatever right we give ourselves, because these are our stories, our backgrounds, and what is the right way of doing it? Stories change through time, as people change through time, and if we try to put things up on a shelf, like in a museum, then we're not really, we're not allowing them to be the dynamic thing that they actually are. So that's going to upset some people, but it's also going to make other people feel seen.
Yeah, well, no one gets on George R. R. Martin's back about not teaching them enough about the War of the Roses, which is what inspired Game of Thrones, right? So, all right, Lori, let's talk about you.
I feel like you guys covered it really well. I don't know that I ever felt the pressure to write my culture specifically, because my family was like really great in that they just supported whatever I wanted to write, except for my brother. The one person out of the whole family is just like, why don't you write about Hmong history? And at the time I was just like, because I want to write fantasy, and fantasy is only white, so that didn't work, but I think part of the reason why I didn't write it was, first, I initially had to get over that hump of this is not what people want to read. And then once I got over that, it was the fear, again, like what you said, the pressure of like, if I do this, what if I get it wrong? What if my family, my friends, my community, because the Hmong community is very, very, very tight knit. Everybody knows everybody. Like, so what if they read this and they're just like, what did she do? Like, what is this? Mm-hmm. This is the first time, potentially, for the Hmong culture to be in mainstream, fantasy, and like, what does she do? She butchered it. So there's that fear for sure, which is part of the reason also why I wanted Forest of Souls to be more this weird mesh of both, because one, that represents me more as a person, and two, because then I'd be like, well, it's not really Hmong. So I could sort of brush that off. And then between Forest of Souls, me writing Forest of Souls, and now, I think I gave myself that permission to be just like, if I'm going to write about my culture, I'm going to do what I want with it because it's mine. So, and the thing about Hmong stories is that it's an oral tradition. We didn't even have a written language until like 1950s, 60s, maybe. And so stories were told orally for centuries, and they would be changed, and they would be like, it would depend on the storyteller, they would be embellished and altered and whatever. Like, ask 5 different Hmong people from 5 different areas of the world, and they'll tell you different versions of the same story. So I just felt like, if I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do what I want. I'm going to create a fantasy world that incorporates my culture, and then just have fun with it the way like a white author would be able to do with their own history. So actually last year I wrote a book that is very unapologetically a portal fantasy into the spirit realm, and it is very Hmong, and it is very fantasy, and it's me altering the culture the way I want to alter it in order to fit into this world that I think kids will love. And there's a freedom in that, I think, and if people like it, that's awesome. If they don't, I'm sorry. That, I guess, that story wasn't for you.
Yeah. Well, that kind of brings me sort of a little bit to the next question I wanted to talk about, which was sort of, we all write our books in English, meaning that our books will be published in Anglophone countries first, for the most part. And there's always that question or an expectation of the audience, and it's really the white default, if we're going to be completely honest here. And, we write for ourselves, obviously. We write these stories because we wanted to see them. We wanted to have them when we were young. But then there's always this question of, well, how much do we also allow an outsider into our world to play, right? To let them the way, we would have read like a white fantasy novel when we were young, and we were allowed to play here with, knights and sword fighting and dragons and that kind of a thing. Like, how do we sort of tailor our own work for the white audience? And also at the same time, and I think this is something that a lot of white authors don't have to worry about, is worrying about what people from the home countries, I'm not going to, not that we're necessarily from there per se, but, those are mostly ethno-homogenous countries. So there's sort of a cultural language that everybody speaks. And then you're trying to draw on that tradition, trying to get it from both sides to some extent. So I want to talk about how we navigate this, how we allow outsiders in, and how we are also trying to be respectful to people, whose traditions that we do come from. And the sort of example that I use is my mother is an interpreter. She is a Korean English interpreter. And when I was young, my first job was my mom would take some transcripts and then translate it from Korean to English. But when you directly translate it, idiomatically, it does not make any sense in English. So the thing that she would have me do, and my mother speaks perfect English. She's been here for a very long time. She doesn't even have an accent, quote unquote, so she idiomatically speaks English incredibly well, but she would still ask me to go through it and give it another layer of translation so that whoever is reading this transcript would understand what the original source was. So I want to talk a little bit about this. I struggle with this a lot. Am I translating too much? Am I not translating enough? That sort of a thing. So Shveta, why don't we start with you?
Sure. This is actually something that I decided a while ago I wasn't going to worry about, actually. I think that when you hit a certain level of craft, you are able to define the details that need to be defined without spelling them out for anybody. And then if there's something that still isn't clear, well, we have this magic thing called Google or libraries, I think the problem is more, at least with regard to a North American audience in particular, is that they are used to not having to work at stuff because they already understand the references. So then they, but that's not our problem. We had to know their stuff. Why can't they do a little work to understand ours? And so honestly, if I do need to define something, I try to find like an elegant way to do it that isn't like, for example, chai tea. Please, guys, chai means tea. Don't do that. I would, it's that kind of thing. Like if it's a kind of food like shiro, which I used in Star Daughter, which you wouldn't necessarily, know what it is. I just talk about like how buttery and warm and rich it was. And I figure that's all you really need. And if you're really curious, Google it.
I mean, Tolkien didn't define lembas bread. We all know it's bread.
Right.
All right. So then, Nafisa, let's talk about you, ma'am.
Okay, so that's one thing that I have been very all the reviewers who read my book, they wonder why I haven't defined more things than I have, and that was actually, I intentionally did not define many of the words that I use, because if you spend time defining things, you cannot get an immersive experience, right? Because there's always that sense of I'm telling you what this is because you don't know. So I figured that if they couldn't get it by the nuance or the context, they can just look in the glossary. I have a 7-page glossary at the back, and I've also gotten complaints about that. But I figure that most of the stuff that I was talking about was food and cultural specificities, which if you start to explain what a nikah, like a marriage, is, you lose the romantic tension, because you're like, oh yeah, this is what it is. And so I am probably fall on the spectrum of not defining enough, which I'm actually fine with, because if I'm going to, what I promise with my book is to give you an immersive experience with colors, smells, and experiences. It's very tactile. So if you are going to read my book, you are going to get that experience. Otherwise, you're probably going to be very disappointed. And I'm very unapologetic about that, and I'm glad that my editor and my publisher were fine with it, because they let me not italicize, which is horrible, because all of my book would be half italicized. But yeah, I mean, I think as authors, we have to decide the kind of stories we're telling and the kinds of liberties we want to take with the stories we're telling. And with the support we get, we can tell it as authentically as we can, or you can just read the textbook and see what the definitions are. Yeah.
All right, Julie.
So I definitely agree with, we're writing fiction and we're not writing textbooks. And I think if Shveta's story says buttery, warm, something, I'm like, I'm in, I'll eat that. I don't need further definitions. So for me, it's, I think going back to the question of, do we need to translate it for the US audience? I think yes, in terms of craft of saying like giving reference points, like for any book does a reasonable job, I think, of communicating through reference points. But I think the cultural aspects are not necessarily things that we have to feel pinned to saying like this is, so onigiri is a rice ball, blah blah blah. It can just, like it can be buttery warm bread, or it can be a sweet that's so fragrant that is, so enchanting. And then for me, I think I realized, despite the feedback that I'd gotten from that person before, I think I realized I did a good job for the audience that I had intended. When my father, who had sort of blackmailed me into getting an arc, giving him an arc, was like, he read it and then he said, "Oh my gosh, there's like things like yuzu or like tsudanuma or like there's like Japanese stuff in this book," and then he was very excited, and I was like, "Why are you so excited?" And I was like, and I realized for him growing up, he hadn't had those things in the books he read. He read the classics, like that are very white and very Western focused. And for him, it was a totally new experience. And that's the kind of experience I want to give to other readers in the future, where it's a joy to read about and not, well, you didn't put enough in your 7-page glossary or something like that. So I think maybe it doesn't translate perfectly for all US readers or all American or Western readers, but for those that it does, I hope it makes Eva and my story meets the right people.
All right, Lori, you're up.
Yeah. Sorry. What Julie said, basically. Like I specifically, there are reasons I wrote the book the way it was, for like, I want the book to reach like diaspora teens who need to see themselves in these stories and know that they belong in these stories. Like I was saying before, the stories growing up we read, they were Western fantasy, but we didn't see ourselves in them. So specifically, I wanted to create a world that was inspired, like Western medieval inspired fantasy, but with my cultural influences as well, and with Asian characters, to be like, we belong in these stories just as much as anyone else does. But I do have a glossary in the book as well, but it's not for any like Hmong terms or anything like that. It's because it's a fantasy book, and fantasy books have like lots of terminology, fantasy terminology.
Like
yeah. My book doesn't have a map. I'm so sad about that.
Oh.
But yeah. Yeah, I try. Other than that, I try not to worry too much about what people are going to say, like now, as opposed to how I was, several years ago. But right now, I try not to worry too much when I'm writing. And for me, like when I was little, fantasy was very much an escape. And I think ultimately that's just what I want for Forest of Souls to be for readers. Just if they can immerse themselves in it and escape for a few hours, then I feel like that's my ideal audience right there.
Yeah, I'm somewhat similar with my series, The Guardians of Dawn, because it is based on East Asia. It's not necessarily based on a specific country, although I think it's a 4-book series, and each book sort of is specifically inspired by a specific region of East Asia. And I kind of, like Lori, was sort of like, one, I am kind of my own test. Does this make sense to me? I had to do so much research into East Asian history and culture and food, because there's even stuff about my own culture that I just don't know, like was born and raised in Los Angeles, and I do go back and forth to Korea quite a bit, and it's not at all like, this like traditional place and all that sort of stuff. But what I found really interesting was certain things that those of us who grew up in kind of Anglophone countries where Christianity is a huge influence, we have a lot of metaphors or things that we just sort of absorb self-consciously through our books, from sort of like a Christian narrative. But that's not necessarily true in East Asia. There's a lot of iconography there from sort of more of a Buddhist tradition that I had no idea, right? We can, at least I studied art history at New York University, and a lot of the sort of stuff that we study in our history, although a lot of those symbols are from Christianity, and I took like one semester of Asian art, and it was trying to learn a whole other culture again that I didn't have to growing up here. So like the fantasy world that I built in the Guardians of Dawn, I was trying to find some way to talk about this iconography that is, or maybe to relate that iconography to more Western familiar ideas. For example, sort of classical elements there in Western philosophy is fire, water, air, and earth. But in a lot of East Asian inspired cultures, it's a five element thing. It's wood, metal, earth, fire, and water. Air is not really one of, so there's kind of a lot of those things that I was like, well, how am I going to relate this to what I knew growing up? And that was me trying to, how faithful do I want to be? How much do I want to open this up to a kid like me, right? That grew up kind of mixed heritage, mixed backgrounds, wanting to get a little bit more in touch with this other side of me, but also feeling a little bit like I don't belong in a purely Asian world either. I think I've got one last question that I hope we can all answer pretty quickly before I think we can open it up for other people. But that's kind of what I want to go back is, where do you sort of stretch and play with these sorts of things? Like for example, the names of the characters in my Guardians of Dawn series are not necessarily strictly names that you would recognize from an East Asian culture, because I was sort of like, well, if George R. R. Martin can like spell Cersei a weird way, I can probably, I was very methodical and thoughtful about how I was constructing these names because I didn't want to betray any sort of tradition or anything like that. But I want to talk a little bit about like, how do you guys stretch and play with these sorts of cultures to fit your own sensibility? So Lori, I'm going to call on you.
I had to unmute. So like what you said about names, I'm like the worst at names. It's the last thing I do when I'm writing a book. The names are last for maybe the entire first draft. They're just character one, which is not good. But so in terms of names, like I wanted the names to this is gonna sound so bad, to sound Hmong or to sound Asian, but to not be
I'm right
be a
there.
match.
I'm right there.
Right? Because names also have meaning in Asian cultures. There is a lot of baggage attached to certain names, and to especially to family names, and like to why we name our kids a specific way. So I didn't want to run into that sort of issue if someone read the book and was just like, you totally misappropriated this name. So that was part of the reason I really wanted to just like, I wanted the names to sound Asian, but to not actually be Asian names. And then I think for the book that I had written last year, that is more unapologetically Hmong, I had to like do a lot of research for that. I think like the really cool thing about my library is that it has an entire section just for Hmong history, which is really cool because there's a very big Hmong population in the area. So there's a very large Hmong section specifically in our library. And you're not going to see that like anywhere else, basically. So I spent a lot of time researching and doing that stuff, and like reading up on folk tales and pulling stories from those folk tales and pulling inspiration from them. And so in that way, I would pull out there's like certain similarities in stories, so I would pull out themes, or there would be like certain characters that recurring through different stories, so I would pull out that specific character and like, you know, make them a deity or something in my world. But I didn't really feel bad about like twisting characters and twisting the stories. Like, for example, there is a character who there's like many different versions of a story of this character, of this woman who she is constantly being she's constantly being manipulated by gods, and specifically by men, and she's always a victim in there, where like she'll be the perfect wife, and she'll fall in love with a guy who probably doesn't deserve her, and then he'll leave her for someone else, and then he'll realize, oh no, she was better, and now I have to go back and earn her back, and then she gets kidnapped by like a demon, or like a dragon lord, and then like they get separated forever, and like all these tragic stories, different versions of this story with this woman like constantly being manipulated by all these things. So I'm just like, I'm gonna make her a trickster god in my story. She's a trickster god, and she manipulates all these terrible men into falling in love with her, and then she breaks their hearts. And so like that's how I wanted to interpret, or I just wanted to like reimagine this character who always got shafted in and was always a victim in all these stories. So that's just an example of how I took what was a traditional story and was just like, I'm gonna do this instead.
All right. Well, thank you. Nafisa, do you want to talk about your experiences?
For sure. I too like names. I mean, my book was about names, but one thing I did was that every name in The Candle and the Flame has a different meaning. So all the names of the royal family have something to do with the sun, and Fatima was the Prophet Muhammad's daughter, and Zulfikar, who is the male love interest, was actually the name of the sword that was given to her husband in real life. So I played around with these aspects. Another thing I did was because even though the Noor is a fictional place, the people coming to Noor are real, from the real world. But instead of calling them by the names that the West has given them, for example, I didn't call the Japanese people. I called them Nihongo, and because I wanted them to be called what they call themselves and not what the West calls them. So I put in little details like that to anchor the story in the real world, but at the same time respect the traditions of the people of the world instead of the Western culture. Yeah.
Julie.
So, JJ, it's really interesting that you bring up names, because for me, that's something that when growing up, I've always been thinking about, because I have like an American first name and then a Japanese middle name and then a Japanese last name. And so people are like, oh, you're like American, then you have an American first name. I'm like, yes, but. And then when I named my characters, obviously Eva Evergreen is a very like American sounding name, but I actually tried to bring in a Japanese aspect to it, especially for her last name. It's evergreen, which is like, like pine trees and stuff like that. And the reason why like I went with that name is because Japan had an earthquake back in 2011, almost 10 years ago. I was living in Japan at the time, I had to live through the earthquake, so that was a very big influence on me. And there's a story that I found about this one pine tree in this area, the coastal region, that like everything else got swept away by the tsunami except for this one pine tree that kept standing. And it worked so well with the heart of my story that I was like, okay, Evergreen, like she's like the little pine tree, like she keeps standing tall no matter what. And so for me personally, it's maybe her last name doesn't seem Japanese, but I think the meaning and the background that I have for it is what I want for the story, even though it's not necessarily coded as Japanese. So I think things like that will help, even though it definitely stretches things, but
yeah. I mean, I think we're allowed to do that, right? These are our backgrounds and stories. So, Shveta, do you want to be the last person to add to this?
Sure. And my
No
thoughts
pressure.
are actually, I have thoughts about names too. I decided a long time ago that I was only going to use Sanskrit derived names for all my characters because I'm so sick and tired of people saying things to me and other people I know, like, your name is too hard. Like, what does that even mean? You know, and or they won't ask how to pronounce it. You know, so like I've been called Shveta and my name is Shveta, and it's not hard, but you know, like there's just this weird idea that, oh, that's not an Anglo name or a Greek name, so I can't say it. You know, I'm not even going to try. In fact, when I was at my last day job, the payroll person came around with our check stubs, and she looked at mine and she was like, I can't even say this. I'm going to call you Sue. And I was like, no, you're not. My name is Shweta. And I don't care if you can't say it exactly, but you know, like what kind of colonial arrogance is that to tell somebody you're going to rename them? So, you know, and I'm like, we're not doing that. And so for me, you know, names, they have, as we've all said, they have a lot of meaning. And I also, and JJ, you had brought up too, that you had to do a lot of research. There's so much about my heritage I don't know. And you know, whatever research I've done is not enough. It's not even close, especially because we have this idea in the West that India, for example, South Asia is one like flattened thing where everybody shares the same traditions and ideas. And it's not that way at all. Like, if you know anything about Hindu thought, for example, will you be surprised to know that there's a whole school of Hindu materialism that, you know, doesn't believe in God and doesn't, you know, thinks that everything we see right here is all there is? Probably not. Probably you weren't expecting that because you have an idea of what it is. And I feel like that's what's happening when people are like, oh, your book's not Japanese enough, or oh, this and that they have their flattened idea of what a culture is. And if we stretch, as we were, you know, past that, they get uncomfortable. And sometimes that's even people within the culture who feel that way because they're even holding on to these ideas of, you know, what it means. And yes, we do have to do some grappling with what does the fact that modern Western culture has gone around the world and has changed it for better or for worse. I mean, we could have a debate about whether that's good or bad some other time, but it has affected everything and everybody. And we have to, you know, what does that mean for us? And I think that in writing these stories, we are kind of grappling with that a bit. Like what you were saying about the name Evergreen, that's such a lovely idea, but, you know, like but it's something that we wouldn't have necessarily known you were doing, right? And yet you were, and Julie. So I hope that makes some sense. But
oh yeah, no, I think that sounds. I mean, we all obviously come at this from different angles, but you know, it's always trying to synthesize our, you know, our backgrounds and how we were raised in a Western society. So, all right, I think we have time for questions. So let me see. All right, the first one is from, I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name, Kai Gosha. What was your research process like? Did you guys consult relatives, books, etc.? So I'll just start very quickly and everybody can jump in as they see fit. But I did a lot of traveling. Not a lot of my Korean relatives are actually alive. Most of my mom's side is from North Korea. So they either didn't make it out or it's just my mom. So I did a lot of travel to Asia and it did a lot of reading, like a lot of reading. So what about the rest of you guys?
I did a lot of reading for sure. And, you know, I asked a couple of people where I could, but it was mostly reading. And hilariously, I went to my husband a lot too. And he's a white guy, which is why this is funny. But he's very much a scholar of Hinduism and Buddhism and Indian history. So he knows way more than I do, to the point that my mom jokes he must have secretly be half Desi. but yeah, I mean, it's a lot of reading and, you know, and just remembering that for any kind of folklore, there are going to be a million versions of everything. So whatever is authentic, you can just throw right out the window.
Yeah. Lori, Nafisa, Julie, anybody, just jump in.
Oh, so my second book is, I don't know why I did this to myself, but it's set in 14 different cities around the world. Each chapter is a different city, and I spent a lot of time virtually walking the streets because I needed to get the feeling of being in the city. So thank you, Google Maps, because I was like, yeah, I'm Beirut today. And my mom's like, oh, good for you. I'm like, And also, I did a lot of reading, and then you read. What I find is that reading folk tales from a culture you're not familiar with gives you a lot of insight about the culture, and so yeah, I did a lot of reading as well.
Yeah, lots of reading. Like I said, the whole library section or the section at my library, and also listening to my mom tell stories, because she definitely grew up in that time before like the written language, so it's still very much an oral tradition for her. So the way she tells them is just so engaging, and so I would just take out my phone and literally record her like telling these stories so that I can listen to them later and like pick them apart better. And also my Hmong is not super great, and she tells them in Hmong, so I have to listen to them more slowly so I can like pick out what she's actually saying.
That's a great way to get research. I wish I love that. For me, it's definitely like it's a mix of Google Maps. Like I love Google Maps. Like it takes you everywhere. And I actually, for me personally, I gather all my research into like this 80-page like slideshow just to keep everything, because it's secondary world, you know. So I'm making up my own world as I pull in influences from the real world. So having that doc definitely keeps me all synced up hopefully as much as I can.
All right, next question from Eunice Kim. Do you ever put your friends or family in your books and have them make fun cameos or anything like that?
No, I did. I actually put my maternal grandpa in one of the first. He was a flower seller. Unfortunately, he passed away before he could read the book. But I felt like it was a nice way to immortalize him or memorialize him. So every time I read him, I feel like he's still alive in some ways. Yeah.
For me,
I don't. Yeah, that's really beautiful, because I don't. If my relatives read my books, they all think that they are all the characters in my books, no. So I just don't.
I actually have a cousin whose name is Zulfikar, who's a love interest, and he is convinced it is him. And I'm like, no. Well, one thing, you're never anywhere as cool as my main character.
I like to imagine that, right? So for me, I do for book one. I don't think I have a lot of people. I don't think I put anyone in. But for book two, I did have some fun and put some friends in. But the biggest thing I think is Ember is based on my Shiva, who is just as troublesome, loves food just as much, and was like the runt of her litter as well. And so she's definitely a big influence for book one.
I did this very deliberately in a story in an anthology, Toil and Trouble. I put I'm even in there, and that's all I'll say about that.
Ooh. All right, Lori, do you include people that you know, or?
No, I never want to run into that where they're just like, where they pick it out and they're like, is this? I'm like, because what if I want to give them a quality that maybe they don't like, so I never want to run into that sort of issue.
My father read the father character in Winter Song was like, clearly this bum is based on me, right? And I was like, no, Dad, like, just no. All right, last question. It's from Kat. What reality competition show would your main character probably win?
Oh gosh.
It's terrible. I don't watch a lot of reality TV. Well, for Winter Song and Shadow Song, I think Liesel would probably go on some sort of like The Voice or something and then just not win. And I think the main character of my first book in the Guardian series would probably be on like a cooking reality show. But she's like not super fancy, but she does like food.
I mean, the main character of my second novel, Paheli, she would go on all the competitions and she would be convinced that she'd win and she'd come last, and then she'd be confused why. Which is really great.
I love that.
Well, I'm trying to think how to answer this because, like I said, there is an actual competition in Star Daughter.
Right.
So, and I don't want to spoil anything. So all I'm going to say is maybe, and something like America's Got Talent, and
I think I would love for my characters for Eva to go on like the Great British Baking Show or something food related, just because I want to eat all the food.
Yeah.
Yeah, so my character is a spy in training, and she practices a lot of physical training. So I think it like a physical show, like Ninja Warrior or something.
All right, I think those were all of our questions. Why don't we just go through very quickly and say our goodbyes by saying our names and our books, just to drive that home for people. So I'm S.J. Jones. I'm the author of Winter Song and Shadow Song and the forthcoming Guardians of Dawn series. So Julie.
I'm Julie Abbott, the author of Eva Evergreen, Semi-Magical Witch, which is coming out in August.
Nafiza.
I'm Nafiza Azad, and I'm the author of The Candle and the Flame and the forthcoming The Wild Ones next summer.
I am Lori Emily. I'm the author of Gates of Feather and Stone and The Infinite, and then the forthcoming Forest of Souls, coming out June 23rd.
I'm Shveta Thakrar, and my novel Star Daughter will be out on August 11th. And I wanted to say, by the way, that it is a contemporary fantasy, not a historical fantasy, because there seemed to be some confusion about that.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. So have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.